Jordan Blake stepped out of her car, taking a long, deep breath as she surveyed the park. The sun was warm, casting a glow over the cityscape, and the families gathered for picnics, the soft hum of laughter and distant chatter mixing with the gentle rustling of leaves. She loved this park, her refuge from the intensity of her work as an FBI agent. Today, she was here as simply Jordan, not Agent Blake, and she intended to enjoy every minute of it. With a book under her arm and a small bag of snacks, she made her way to her favorite bench by the lake, slightly tucked away from the main paths but with a beautiful view of the water and the serene ducks drifting by. Settling in, she opened her book and let herself sink into the story, feeling the tension of the week begin to ease from her shoulders. But only a few minutes in, a voice sliced through the calm, a voice that was harsh, loud, and unmistakably directed at her. "Hey, you there!" came the shout, with an edge that instantly pulled Jordan from her moment of peace. Looking up, she saw a man marching towards her. His stance was rigid, his expression irritated. Even from a distance, she could sense an air of entitlement about him. "Can I help you?" Jordan asked, keeping her tone steady, though her pulse quickened. She couldn't quite place it, but something about him set her on edge. "Yeah," he snapped, folding his arms across his chest, his posture practically radiating contempt. "You can help by moving. That's my bench." Jordan blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" she replied, genuinely perplexed by the audacity of his demand. "I didn't see any sign saying this was reserved." He rolled his eyes as if her comment was absurd. "I don't need a sign. I've been coming here for years. Everyone around here knows this is my spot," he said, gesturing broadly to the lake and the bench as if he owned not only this small corner of the park, but the entire lakeside view. The irritation in Jordan's chest flared, but she kept her tone polite. "It's a public park. There's plenty of space for everyone, and I'm sure you can find another bench." But rather than taking the hint, the man's expression darkened further. His scowl deepened, his eyes narrowing with a mix of anger and disdain. "You don't get it, do you?" he sneered. "People like you don't just waltz in here and take over what isn't theirs." Jordan's spine straightened. She didn't need to ask what he meant by people like you, but the words hit her with a pang of frustration. The easy afternoon she'd planned was rapidly slipping away, replaced by this man's simmering hostility. She took a measured breath, trying to maintain her calm. "Do you realize how ridiculous you sound right now?" she asked, her voice sharp but controlled. He smirked, stepping closer, his body language dripping with condescension. "Not as ridiculous as someone like you thinking you belong here," he retorted, looking around as if to emphasize his point. "Look around. You don't fit in." Jordan clenched her jaw, her patience wearing thin. "I don't need to fit in to sit on a public bench," she replied, her voice steely and unyielding. "If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to find another place to sit." His face flushed, and his hands curled into fists by his sides as he took another aggressive step toward her, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You think you can just talk to me like that?" She held her ground, unflinching. "Touch me, and you'll regret it," she said, her tone unwavering. For a brief moment, she saw his confidence waver, a flicker of uncertainty passing across his face. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a renewed scowl. He leaned in closer, his words dripping with venom. "You people don't know when to keep your mouth shut," he snarled. "Maybe it's time you learned." Jordan's patience shattered. She set her book aside and rose, her face mere inches from his, her voice rising with a controlled fury. "Back off. Now." "I'm not moving, and you don't get to tell me what to do," she declared, her tone sharp enough to make his confidence falter once more. A hush fell over the nearby parkgoers, a few of whom had begun to watch the scene unfold. The man glanced around, noticing their stares, and for a brief moment, a look of embarrassment flashed across his face. He looked back at her, his bravado flickering. "Fine," he spat, stepping back with a scowl, his voice still full of contempt. "Enjoy your little attitude. You'll regret it." Jordan's gaze followed him as he turned and stalked toward the parking lot, his figure growing smaller with each step. She let out a slow breath, her heart pounding. She knew that people like him didn't often back down, and his parting words had left a lingering sense of unease. Still, she took her seat again, attempting to let the tranquility of the lake soothe her rising irritation. She tried to pick up her book, but the words blurred on the page as her mind drifted back to his sneering face, his hateful words. Minutes passed, and her muscles began to relax. But just as she was starting to feel calm, she noticed a shadow in her peripheral vision. She looked up and saw him again, standing over her with his arms crossed, the same contemptuous scowl etched into his face. "Still here?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. He leaned in, his mocking tone even sharper than before. "I thought I made it clear. This is my spot." Jordan's anger flared as she set her book down and stood once more, holding his gaze. "And I thought I made it clear that I'm not moving," she replied, her voice cold. He sneered, stepping closer. "You people always think you're entitled to whatever you want, don't you?" he hissed. "Think you can just barge in here, act like you belong?" The simmering anger within her ignited. "You don't get to talk to me like that," she said, her voice firm. "If you have a problem, maybe you should go find a spot far away from me." But instead of backing down, he leaned in, his face inches from hers. "Oh, is that a threat?" he sneered. "I don't take kindly to threats from people like you." Jordan's composure cracked, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm tone. "The only person who doesn't belong here is the one who can't handle sharing a public space." In a sudden movement, he reached out and gripped her arm, yanking her forward. His voice was low and full of contempt. "You think you're so tough," he spat. But Jordan didn't flinch. Instead, her voice dropped, calm yet unyielding. "Let go of me," she said. "This is your last chance." The man's face twisted with disdain as he stared down at her, ignoring her warning. But in the depths of her unwavering gaze, he saw something he didn't expect, a confidence that was immovable, a defiance that refused to be diminished. And for the first time, a flicker of doubt appeared in his hardened expression, as if he'd just realized that maybe, just maybe, he was no longer in control. The man's grip on Jordan's arm tightened, his fingers pressing into her skin with an intensity that sent a surge of pain radiating up her arm. Yet, despite the discomfort, she held his gaze, her expression remaining calm and unyielding. Her years as an FBI agent had trained her for moments exactly like this, where intimidation and aggression were just masks worn by individuals to compensate for their insecurities. But this time was different. This time, it was personal. "Let go," she repeated, her voice cold and steady. He ignored her warning, leaning in closer, his breath hot and sour against her cheek. "You're really testing my patience, you know that?" His tone was low and full of disdain, his arrogance pushing him into a dangerous place where he seemed to believe he could do anything he wanted without consequence. Jordan felt the anger rise within her, a simmering fury that had been held in check through countless encounters with people like him, people who looked at her and saw nothing but their own prejudice staring back. But she wasn't about to let him think he could bully her into submission. "Take your hand off me," she said, her voice calm, though her patience was rapidly wearing thin. Her gaze was as steady as steel, her body tense, ready to act if he dared take things any further. His smirk deepened, and in one swift, unexpected motion, he raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The force of the blow stunned her, her head snapping to the side as a sharp, stinging pain spread across her cheek. Jordan steadied herself, her hands clenching at her sides as she took a steadying breath. She could feel the eyes of the people nearby, their silent shock lingering in the air. Her gaze returned to him, her expression resolute, the calm returning to her voice as she looked him directly in the eye. "That," she said, her voice like ice, "was a mistake." "Oh yeah," he laughed, though the sound was hollow, betraying a flicker of uncertainty. "And what are you going to do about it? Call the police? You think they're going to believe some angry woman over me?" Jordan didn't respond, didn't rise to his taunt. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket with a practiced, deliberate motion, pulling out her FBI badge and holding it up to his face, letting the sunlight glint off the metal. The arrogance on his face faltered, his smirk fading as he took in the badge, his confidence evaporating in an instant. He stammered, his eyes widening with dawning realization. You're really FBI? That's right, she replied, her voice unyielding. And now, you're under arrest for assault. The color drained from his face, his bravado dissolving into something much closer to panic. He stumbled back, his hands coming up defensively, as if to ward off the reality of his situation. Wait a second, he stammered, his eyes darting around, looking for a way out. This is ridiculous. You can't arrest me for something like this. It's not that serious. Serious enough that you thought you could hit me and walk away, she replied, taking a step closer. Turn around. Hands behind your back. He froze, his mind clearly racing as he processed her command. But instead of complying, a flash of desperation crossed his face, and in one swift motion, he bolted. Without warning, he spun on his heel and took off in a full sprint toward the parking lot. Jordan's instincts kicked in immediately. She took off after him, her body moving with the practiced precision of someone who had trained for this exact kind of chase. She raced across the grass, her focus narrowing on his retreating figure, her mind calculating his likely moves, mapping out the parking lot in her mind. She knew that running wouldn't get him far. She'd already memorized his face, his car model, and, if she had anything to say about it, his license plate number. Her pulse pounded, her breath steady as she closed the gap between them, her mind running through every possible tactic to corner him before he could get away. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes widening as he saw her gaining on him. Panic flared in his expression as he pushed himself harder, his pace frantic as he neared the edge of the parking lot. She saw him reach for his keys, fumbling as he tried to unlock his car in his desperation to escape. Jordan sprinted harder, her feet pounding against the pavement as she reached out, just inches from grabbing him when he managed to yank his car door open and dive inside. She reached for the handle, but he slammed the door shut and locked it, his hands fumbling as he scrambled to start the engine. For a split second, their eyes met through the glass, his, wild with fear, hers, calm and unyielding. Step out of the car, she commanded, her voice sharp and clear, carrying the authority that came with her position. But he ignored her, his hand shaking as he finally managed to start the car. The engine roared to life, and with a screech of tires, he backed out of the space, narrowly missing another parked car as he sped toward the exit. Jordan took a quick step back, watching as he sped away, a cloud of dust and exhaust left in his wake. But she wasn't about to let him get away that easily. Pulling out her phone, she quickly dialed into the FBI dispatch, relaying his license plate number and a detailed description of his car, her voice calm and efficient as she updated them on the situation. Suspect fleeing in a blue sedan, license plate Bravo Tango 047. Requesting backup, she said, slipping her badge back into her jacket as she turned toward her own car. Without hesitation, she jumped into the driver's seat, her own engine roaring to life as she pulled out of the parking lot in pursuit. Her focus sharpened, her mind calculating his possible escape routes, mapping out the city streets and the likely places he might try to hide. She knew the area well enough to predict his next move, and as she sped down the road, every nerve in her body was on high alert. Her cheek still stung from his slap, the lingering pain fueling her determination to bring him to justice. She kept a steady pace, maneuvering through traffic with practiced ease as she scanned the road, searching for any sign of his car. Then, a flash of blue caught her eye up ahead. She saw him weaving through traffic, his car jerking erratically as he tried to stay ahead, running a red light in his desperation. She tightened her grip on the wheel, accelerating to keep pace, carefully navigating through the trail of honking cars he left behind. He was making a run for the outskirts, she realized, likely trying to reach the quieter roads where he might have a better chance of evading her. But she was ready. She took a shortcut, a side street that would cut a few seconds off her pursuit, and as she rounded the bend, she saw her opportunity. She floored the gas, her car surging ahead as she came around the corner, positioning herself just ahead of him. She braked, bringing her car to a controlled stop that blocked the narrow street. She stepped out, her expression resolute, her voice commanding. "Step out of the car." Now. He froze, his face a mask of shock and disbelief as he stared at her through the windshield. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but they were alone on the quiet road, surrounded by empty industrial buildings. He had nowhere to go, his car trapped between hers and the dead-end road. Slowly, with visible frustration and a hint of fear, he opened the door and stepped out, his hands raised halfway in a gesture that was part surrender, part defiance. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice laced with anger and desperation. "You don't have the right to do this. You're overreacting." Jordan kept her eyes on him, her stance firm. "Assaulting a federal officer and evading arrest isn't a minor issue," she replied, her tone unyielding. "Get down on the ground. Hands behind your back." He hesitated, glancing around one last time, as if still hoping for a way out. But there was none. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered himself to his knees, his face twisted with humiliation and resentment. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," he muttered, his voice a venomous hiss as he glared up at her. "You don't know who I am." Jordan moved in, securing the handcuffs around his wrists with a practiced ease, her grip firm as she led him to her car. "I know exactly who you are," she replied, ignoring his threats as she guided him into the back seat. As she closed the door and returned to the driver's seat, she felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her. The anger in his eyes told her that his sense of entitlement had been challenged in a way he wasn't prepared for. And for the first time, he was realizing that he wasn't above the law. As they drove toward the precinct, the silence in the car was punctuated only by his occasional muttered curses. Jordan glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her expression steady, her determination unwavering. She had done her job, and justice was just beginning. Jordan guided her car through the familiar streets, the distant hum of the city punctuated only by the angry muttering from the man cuffed in the back seat. Gregory Hale's eyes glared daggers at her through the rearview mirror, his face twisted in an expression that was equal parts rage and disbelief. For a man who seemed accustomed to getting his way, the cold reality of his situation was starting to sink in, and it was clearly making him squirm. As they pulled up to the precinct, Jordan parked and stepped out, making her way to the back door of the car. She opened it with a swift, professional motion, her expression calm, as if she had done this 1,000 times before, because she had. She reached in, gripping Hale's arm firmly but not harshly, and helped him out of the vehicle. His face flushed with anger as he realized he was no longer the one in control. "Do you even know who you're dealing with?" he spat, his voice low but dripping with venom. Jordan raised an eyebrow but didn't reply. She'd dealt with his kind before, men who wore entitlement like a shield, believing that it would protect them from the consequences of their actions. Men who assumed that people like her, whether because of her gender, her race, or her position, were beneath them, merely obstacles to be dismissed. Today, though, he would find that shield useless. They walked through the precinct's entrance, drawing a few curious looks from other officers and staff as she led him inside. Jordan kept her face impassive, guiding Hale with a firm but steady hand toward the booking desk. The officer at the desk, a tall man with a thick mustache and a casual demeanor, raised an eyebrow as they approached. "Well, well," he murmured, taking in Hale's expensive suit and seething expression with a smirk. "What do we have here?" "Gregory Hale," Jordan replied, keeping her tone all business. "He's here on charges of assaulting a federal officer, resisting arrest, and evading law enforcement." The officer let out a low whistle, clearly impressed. He eyed Hale with a bemused expression, then glanced back at Jordan. "Fancy-looking guy like this? High-dollar watch, fancy suit, guess it didn't do him much good, did it?" Hale scowled, his face flushing with indignation. "This is absurd," he muttered, his voice low but furious. "Do you even know who I am?" "Oh, we know exactly who you are," the officer replied with a dry chuckle. He picked up a clipboard, jotting down Hale's information without a hint of sympathy. "And we also know what you did, which means right now, you're just another perp waiting for a cell." Jordan felt a flicker of satisfaction at the officer's words, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew Hale's type. They counted on their status, on their wealth, on every layer of privilege they had ever been given. It was always the same, they believed the rules didn't apply to them. But here, in this precinct, there were no titles or privileges to shield him. Here, he was just another person facing the consequences of his actions. The booking process continued, Hale growing increasingly uncomfortable as each step stripped him of a little more of his dignity. His fingerprints were taken by a no-nonsense officer, a woman in her early 50s with a sharp, unimpressed gaze. She guided his hands to the ink pad, pressing each finger down and rolling it onto the paper with a brisk efficiency. "Looks like you don't have any idea how dumb this was," she muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise. "Thought you could just slap a federal officer and get away with it?" Hale glared at her, his face tight with anger and frustration. "I didn't know she was FBI," he hissed as if that somehow excused his behavior. "This whole thing is being blown out of proportion. I didn't do anything wrong." The officer let out a snort of disbelief. "Didn't do anything wrong? You slapped a woman in public, tried to run from the law, and I'd say that's more than enough wrong." His jaw clenched, and he turned to Jordan, his gaze seething with frustration. "You're really going to throw away your career over this?" He sneered. "Do you have any idea what kind of connections I have? You could have walked away from this, but instead, you had to make it personal." Jordan met his gaze without flinching, her tone cool and resolute. "This isn't personal, Mr. Hale. It's justice. You attacked me, resisted arrest, and thought you were above the law. My job is to ensure people who act like that face the consequences." One of the younger officers nearby overheard her response and gave a small approving nod, his expression one of quiet respect. But Hale bristled, his fists clenched as he struggled to keep his composure. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he muttered, his voice low and menacing. "This isn't over. People like me don't go down without a fight." The officer with the mustache raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "People like you?" he asked with a smirk. "Last I checked, people like you don't get a free pass for breaking the law. Maybe that's news to you, but around here, everyone faces the music." Hale opened his mouth to retort, but before he could say anything, the officer gave him a slight nudge, guiding him toward the holding cell area. The smirk on the officer's face suggested he was enjoying every moment of watching this entitled man's bravado crumble. As they reached the cell area, Hale glanced back at Jordan, his face contorted with a mix of anger and desperation. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life, you know that?" he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have connections, resources, more than you can imagine. You don't stand a chance." Jordan crossed her arms, her expression impassive. "Mr. Hale, I don't care about your connections. You're here because of your actions, not your title or your wealth. And threats won't get you out of this." The officer chuckled, shaking his head as he unlocked the cell door. "I've seen some arrogant types in here, but you, my friend, take the cake," he said dryly. "You really thought no one was going to hold you accountable?" Hale glared at him, stepping into the cell with visible reluctance. As the door clicked shut behind him, he turned, his face red with anger, his hands gripping the bars. "This is all going to backfire on you," he muttered, his voice shaky but defiant. "People like me don't end up in places like this." The officer rolled his eyes, giving a nonchalant shrug as he locked the cell door. "Get comfortable, Mr. Hale. You might be in here a while," he replied, his tone unbothered. "And for the record, people like you end up in here every day. It's just that most of them realize they aren't untouchable a bit sooner." Jordan watched as Hale sat down on the cold metal bench inside the cell, his gaze shifting around the small, stark room with a look of disgust. The bravado that had once been so evident in his posture was now replaced by something far less certain. His entitlement, his arrogance, they had all been stripped away, leaving him to confront the reality of his situation. As she turned to leave, he called after her, his voice barely above a whisper, laced with desperation. "This isn't over. You're going to regret this. You're going to pay." Jordan paused, glancing back over her shoulder, her expression calm and steady. "The only thing I regret, Mr. Hale, is that you thought you were above the law. Now you're about to learn just how wrong you were." With that, she walked away, leaving him alone in the quiet of the cell, his arrogance laid bare and his fate sealed. Outside, Jordan exchanged a few words with the booking officers, signing the necessary paperwork to complete his intake. She felt the weight of the day start to lift from her shoulders as she made her way to the front of the precinct, the fresh air filling her lungs as she closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the feeling of justice served. She knew this wasn't the last she'd hear from Hale or his lawyers. Men like him rarely accepted consequences easily. But today, she had reminded him that no one, not even Gregory Hale, was above the law. As she walked to her car, she allowed herself a small smile. Whatever battles lay ahead, she knew she had done her job. The days that followed Gregory Hale's arrest were tense and full of challenges Jordan had expected. As a man who built his life on status and connections, Hale didn't go down quietly. True to his word, his legal team mobilized quickly, wasting no time in launching an aggressive campaign to discredit her and cast doubt on her actions. The morning after the arrest, Jordan's phone rang, and the firm name flashing on the screen told her exactly what to expect. John Merrick, Hale's high-powered attorney, was calling. She took a steadying breath before answering. "Agent Blake," she said, keeping her tone calm and professional. "Agent Blake," came Merrick's measured, almost oily voice. "I'm John Merrick, representing Mr. Hale. I trust you're aware of the unnecessary nature of these charges." His tone was courteous but held a sharp edge. "Mr. Hale is a respected member of this community with an untarnished reputation. Given the circumstances, we believe it would be in everyone's best interest to resolve this quickly and quietly." Jordan recognized the thinly veiled threat in his words. "Mr. Merrick," she replied, her tone unwavering, "your client assaulted a federal officer, resisted arrest, and attempted to evade law enforcement. This case is not going away." There was a pause on the other end, and she imagined Merrick recalibrating, realizing she wouldn't be easily swayed. "Agent Blake," he continued, his voice taking on a chill, "perhaps you're unaware of the connections Mr. Hale holds. His reputation is paramount, and he is prepared to defend it, no matter the cost. A public trial could be detrimental not only to him but to you as well. We would hate to see such a promising agent like yourself embroiled in unnecessary legal battles or unwanted media attention." Jordan's jaw tightened. She had faced her share of intimidation tactics before, but something about the way Merrick delivered his threat, so casually dismissive, irked her. Still, she kept her response calm. "Are you implying that upholding justice for an assault on a federal agent could harm my career, Mr. Merrick?" "I'm simply advising caution," Merrick replied, his voice smooth. "Mr. Hale has connections that could make this entire incident disappear with the right cooperation. Think of it as a professional courtesy." Jordan had heard enough. "I don't negotiate with people who believe they're above the law, Mr. Merrick," she said, her voice hardening. "Please inform your client that he'll have his day in court." She hung up before he could reply, her heart pounding as a rush of determination washed over her. She had known going into this that Hale's power and influence would be wielded against her, but Merrick's veiled threats only steeled her resolve. She wouldn't be intimidated into silence. As the trial date approached, Hale's legal team grew more aggressive. They filed motion after motion, attempting to have the charges reduced or even dismissed entirely. They combed through every aspect of her record, searching for any detail they could twist into a flaw, hoping to undermine her credibility. Meanwhile, subtle but strategic leaks to the media appeared in local papers and online, casting her actions in a dubious light. Headlines questioned her handling of the arrest, her supposed overreaction to the situation, and even her character, insinuating that she had acted impulsively and recklessly. But Jordan remained steadfast. She knew the truth was on her side, and each underhanded tactic only fueled her determination to hold Hale accountable. Her colleagues supported her, many quietly expressing their respect for her bravery, while a few voiced concern over the pressure she was under. But she stayed focused, refusing to let Hale or his lawyers intimidate her. When the trial finally arrived, the courtroom was packed with spectators. Friends and colleagues of Hale filled the benches in a show of support, while a few reporters lingered in the back, eager for any updates on the high-profile case. Jordan took her seat at the front, her face composed, prepared for what lay ahead. Across the room, Hale sat at the defense table, dressed in a meticulously tailored suit, his face tight with a combination of resentment and simmering anger. The smug confidence he had worn the day of the arrest was gone, replaced by a look of barely concealed contempt. His legal team sat beside him, murmuring last-minute advice, casting furtive glances around the room as they prepared their defense. The judge entered, and silence fell as the trial began. The opening statements were tense and carefully delivered. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney with a calm, precise delivery, outlined the case against Hale, describing his behavior at the park, the assault on a federal officer, the attempt to evade arrest, and his blatant disregard for the law. He highlighted Hale's entitlement, emphasizing the way he had wielded his privilege, assuming he could act with impunity. Then it was the defense's turn. Merrick rose, his expression cool and collected as he addressed the jury, speaking in a smooth, almost patronizing tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client is a respected businessman, a valued member of this community. Yes, emotions ran high during this unfortunate incident, but this is a case of misunderstandings, not malice. Mr. Hale merely lost his temper, as we all do on occasion. Should a single moment of frustration destroy his career, his life?" Merrick went on, subtly shifting the focus to Jordan's actions. Agent Blake's response was undeniably excessive, he said, his tone soft yet pointed. Rather than diffusing the situation, she chose to escalate it. A public servant is trained to handle high-stress situations, not inflame them. But instead, she chose to act aggressively, creating the very altercation she claims to condemn. Jordan observed the jury as Merrick spoke, watching their reactions. A few of them furrowed their brows, exchanging glances that reflected a mixture of doubt and curiosity. The judge's expression remained neutral, his gaze fixed on Merrick, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every word. When the prosecution called Jordan to the stand, she rose, walking to the witness box with measured, steady steps. She swore to tell the truth, then took her seat, her gaze meeting each juror as she prepared to recount the events of that day. The prosecutor led her through her testimony, and she described the confrontation at the park with calm precision. She detailed how the argument had begun innocently enough but had rapidly escalated when Hale began making degrading remarks, targeting her with a veiled racism that she couldn't ignore. "He told me that people like me didn't belong there," she said steadily, glancing toward the jury. "That I didn't fit in. When I refused to move, he slapped me. He assumed he could intimidate me and that his connections would protect him." Her words hung heavy in the air, and she could see the discomfort on a few of the jurors' faces. One of them, a woman in her 50s, shifted in her seat, a frown creasing her forehead as she absorbed the implication of Jordan's testimony. When Merrick cross-examined her, his questions were sharp, designed to provoke. "Agent Blake, as a federal agent, are you trained to handle situations like this without escalation?" "Yes," she replied, holding his gaze with calm resolve. "Then wouldn't it have been better to walk away, to avoid conflict?" he pressed, his tone subtly condescending. Jordan didn't falter. Walking away wouldn't have changed his behavior. It would have enabled it, she answered firmly. "As a law enforcement officer, it was my duty to hold him accountable for his actions." Merrick's jaw tightened, but he maintained his polished demeanor. "And yet, you chose to pursue and arrest him yourself. Why not wait for local law enforcement?" "Because he assaulted me and then attempted to flee. My duty as a federal agent is to ensure the law is upheld, regardless of who's involved." Merrick attempted to shift the focus back to Hale's character, painting him as a man who had simply made a mistake. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the jury in his closing argument, "we all have moments where we let frustration get the best of us. My client is no different. This entire situation has been exaggerated beyond reason." But as Jordan watched the jury, she could see that his arguments were falling flat. The jury had seen Hale's arrogance, witnessed his entitlement, and felt the weight of Jordan's testimony. The prosecutor's closing statement emphasized the importance of accountability, of holding individuals like Hale to the same standard as everyone else. After a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Hale sat motionless, his face pale, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. His carefully crafted image, his wealth, his privilege, none of it had saved him. When the court reconvened for sentencing, the judge addressed Hale directly. "Mr. Hale, your actions reflect a disregard for the law, an arrogance that has no place in our society. You will face justice, just like anyone else." Hale was sentenced to 3 years in state prison, with an additional 2 years of probation and 200 hours of community service. The room filled with murmurs, and Hale's face twisted with frustration as he absorbed the reality of his fate. Jordan watched as he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his face drawn, his head held low. She felt a surge of relief, a sense of justice fulfilled. The battle had been long and challenging, but Hale's conviction was a victory for herself and for everyone who had ever felt the sting of prejudice and entitlement. A week after Gregory Hale's sentencing, Jordan found herself seated in a quiet cafe, a warm mug of coffee in hand as she scrolled through her phone. News of Hale's conviction had spread quickly, igniting conversations across social media, in local papers, and around office water coolers. Most headlines were straightforward, highlighting Hale's fall from grace and his sentence. But some dug deeper, touching on the complexities of race, privilege, and entitlement, igniting debate that was both supportive and critical. Some articles praised Jordan for her bravery, framing her as a hero who had stood her ground against a man who believed he was untouchable. Others took a more skeptical tone, implying that she had overstepped, portraying her as overzealous, or questioning the necessity of the confrontation. A few of the comment sections contained sharp undertones, with remarks that subtly or overtly questioned her judgment, insinuating that her actions had been fueled by a chip on her shoulder rather than a commitment to justice. But the criticism didn't surprise Jordan. She knew it was inevitable. From the moment Hale had approached her in the park, his words and actions had been steeped in entitlement and prejudice. He had looked at her, an African-American woman, and assumed he could treat her however he wanted. His comments, "you people, not belonging, and thinking you're entitled," had underscored a belief that his status placed him above her, that she was someone he could bully into submission. And when he realized she wouldn't back down, his response had been violence. Jordan sighed, setting her phone down. She had known that the battle wasn't over just because Hale was convicted. Men like him often had the power to make themselves heard long after the court's verdict. The case had exposed a painful truth, one that extended beyond Hale's individual actions. His entitlement wasn't just about money, it was rooted in a system that had allowed people like him to escape accountability for far too long. Later that day, she met her friend and fellow FBI agent, Maya Torres, for lunch. Maya had been her sounding board and source of support throughout the entire ordeal. As soon as they sat down, Maya rolled her eyes and shook her head. "Did you see some of those comments online?" she asked. People still trying to defend him, saying he just lost his temper, that it wasn't worth a prison sentence. Jordan nodded, stirring her coffee absently. "I saw. A lot of them think I overreacted, that it was just one slap, as if that makes it any less of an assault. But it was more than that, and you know it," she said, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "It was about control. He saw me, and he thought he could talk to me however he wanted, put his hands on me, and walk away unscathed." Maya leaned forward, her expression serious. "Exactly. They don't get it because they've never had to deal with it. Men like Hale think they can act any way they want, and for so long, they've been right. But when he realized you weren't just going to sit there and take it, he panicked." Jordan took a deep breath, letting Maya's words sink in. She knew that what had angered Hale most was her refusal to be intimidated. He hadn't expected her to stand up to him, and when she had, he'd been unable to cope with the sudden loss of control. It wasn't just that he had slapped her, it was what he saw her as, a person who, in his mind, should know her place and accept his dominance without question. "You know," Jordan said, glancing out the window, "he had every advantage, his money, his connections. He really believed he'd walk away, and for a moment, I wondered if he might. But he didn't." Maya's eyes held a fierce pride as she nodded. And that's because you didn't let him. You held him accountable. Men like him, they're not used to hearing no, especially from someone they think they can control. That's why this case is so important. It's not just about justice. It's about showing that no one is above accountability. Jordan nodded slowly. She had felt the weight of this reality throughout the trial. Every subtle dig from Hale's legal team, every sideways glance, every biased comment in the news, it was all a reminder that her actions weren't just being scrutinized as those of an FBI agent but as those of a black woman challenging a wealthy, powerful man. For Hale, that challenge was an unbearable humiliation, a reality that clashed with everything he believed about himself and his place in the world. In the days that followed, Jordan returned to her office to find her inbox flooded with messages. Some were encouraging, praising her for her bravery and thanking her for standing up to someone who represented an all-too-familiar type of privilege. Others, however, were hostile, laced with anger or outright prejudice. A few messages accused her of ruining a good man's life, of overstepping her place, as if she had somehow violated an unspoken rule by demanding that Hale be held accountable. A twinge of sadness settled over her as she read through the responses. She was reminded, as she so often was, that her actions would always be judged through a different lens, one that scrutinized her more harshly simply because of who she was. But she also felt a sense of pride. She had faced down prejudice and privilege head-on and refused to let it silence her. Later that afternoon, her supervisor, Agent Ramirez, stopped by her office. Leaning against the doorway, he nodded approvingly. "I saw the articles," he said, giving her a small smile. "You did good, Jordan. People will talk, they'll criticize, but what you did was right. It takes strength to stand up to someone who thinks they're untouchable." "Thank you," Jordan replied, her voice soft. "It's been a lot to handle, and I knew there'd be backlash. But I couldn't just let him get away with it, not with everything he said and did." Ramirez nodded, a proud glint in his eyes. "And that's what makes you a good agent. You stood your ground, even when it got ugly. People need to see that. It might not change everyone, but it matters." As the media attention around the trial began to fade, Jordan felt the quiet impact of the case resonate within the precinct and in the community. She had encountered moments of racism and entitlement before, both overt and subtle, but this case had forced them into the open. Hale's actions weren't just about him as an individual, they were about the part of society that too often looked the other way when someone with privilege wielded it against others. In the following weeks, Jordan noticed small but meaningful gestures from her colleagues and members of the community. Some officers stopped her in the hallway, nodding in quiet respect. A few strangers recognized her at the grocery store, offering a kind word or a nod of solidarity. The impact of her actions extended beyond the courtroom, reaching people who understood what her fight represented. One afternoon, as she was walking to her car, an older black woman approached her with a warm smile. "I saw what you did in that courtroom," the woman said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us." Jordan felt a lump rise in her throat as she thanked the woman. In that moment, she realized just how deeply the case had resonated. Gregory Hale's sentence wasn't just about prison time or community service, it was a message, a reminder that no one, no matter their wealth or status, was untouchable. As she walked back to her car, a sense of closure settled over her. She knew that this wasn't the last time she would encounter entitlement, prejudice, or threats disguised as power plays. But this was a victory. It was a step toward a world where justice wasn't a privilege but a right, accessible to everyone, no matter who they were or who they faced. And in the quiet spaces of her mind, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had accomplished. She had not only upheld the law but had stood firm against a deeply ingrained injustice. It was a reminder that some fights were worth every ounce of resilience, and as she drove away from the precinct, she knew she was ready for whatever battles lay ahead. Justice, she reminded herself, was blind to privilege, and in the end, it had spoken loud and clear.